Hello Revolution students, and welcome back to another video on the Chinese Revolution area of Study 1. This video we're going to look at the Long March, and you can see that the Long March began on the 16th of October 1934 and ended on the 22nd of October 1935. So it went for over a year. The Long Marches began in, and I'll put a map up here, you can see of China showing, and also the map includes the route of the Long March. So the Long Marches began in Jiangxi province at the Jiangxi Soviet, and there you can see Rujin, the capital of the Jiangxi Soviet, and they marched all the way through here, and they marched up to Shanxi province and to Yan'an, and they established the Yan'an Soviet here, which lasted for over a decade. So the marches, they were forced to, they started their march, they were forced to leave Jiangxi, the Jiangxi Soviet, because Zhang Jieshi and the Kuomintang had managed to encircle them and had conducted a successful encirclement campaign. It was the fifth encirclement campaign. Prior to the fifth encirclement campaign, there were four unsuccessful encirclement campaigns where the CCP had managed to push back the Kuomintang troops. But the fifth encirclement campaign was a success, and the CCP were forced to flee Jiangxi Soviet and march west. In the beginning, they didn't really know where they were going to go. All they knew is they had to escape Jiangxi Soviet, otherwise they would be annihilated by the Kuomintang. And also the other key point, at the beginning of the march, Mao Zedong had very little authority within the party, and he was actually suffering from malaria, so he was being carried on a stretcher at the beginning. One of the key points of the Long March was, at the beginning Mao had very little authority within the party. By the end though, he had managed to establish himself as one of the key leaders of the CCP, and one of the key leaders at the Yan'an Soviet, and then eventually became the leader of the CCP as a consequence of what happened at the Yan'an Soviet. So if you only remember one thing about the Long March, it is that the Long March contributed to Mao becoming the leader of the CCP. There were a few key events along the march which you should understand if you get a question about the Long March on the exam, and which you should refer to and discuss. So I'll go through just quickly. I'm going to look at these in more detail when we go on to the next slide, but first there's a battle down here, the Shang River battle, and at that battle the CCP lost about 70,000 members, or had 70,000 casualties out of the original 100 marches. And then as a consequence of that, they did manage to escape, the survivors, and get to Zunyi. And at Zunyi there was a conference where there was a lot of blame. Some CCP members, the ones who were leading the march, were blamed for, firstly, the failure of the fifth encirclement campaign, where they were forced to leave the Jiangxi Soviet, and they were also blamed for the massive defeats that happened at Shang River battle. And as a consequence, Mao Zedong actually managed to re-establish himself and gain authority within the party, which we're going to look at. After the Zunyi conference, there were lots and lots of battles along the whole route of the march. It was pretty much the whole way the CCP were fleeing the Kuomintang, and Zhang Jieshi was trying to corner them and destroy them. He never managed to do that. One of the key battles, perhaps the most famous battle, is here at Luding Bridge, which we're going to look at in more detail. And that battle exemplified, I suppose, the virtues of the CCP, which we'll look at in a sec. Anyway, they managed to go up here over some very, very high mountains, and they had to go over the grasslands up here. Many CCP members died before they eventually made it to Yan'an. Of the original 100,000 marchers who left Jiangxi Soviet, only 8,000 reached the Yan'an Soviet. However, along the way they did pick up various recruits, and around 22,000. So by the time they got to Yan'an, they had about 30,000 marchers. But of those 30,000, 8,000 had left Jiangxi Soviet. So anyway, let's get into these significant points of the Long March. So on to the next slide. So first, and as I was referring to here, our first point here. So both the 5th Encirclement Campaign, launched on the 6th of October 1933 and pretty much ended with victory for the Kuomintang in October 1934, as well as the defeat at Shang River. Both those defeats demonstrated the poor military and political leadership of Bo Ge and Otto Braun. So they were the two key leaders of the CCP at that time at the Jiangxi Soviet. And they were blamed for these defeats by Mao Zedong and others. And as a consequence, they were blamed when they got to the Zunyi Conference. So the Zunyi Conference lasted from the 15th to the 18th of January. And Mao and others managed to blame Bo Ge and Otto Braun for those defeats and managed to pretty much stage a coup. And they pushed them aside. And Mao managed, as a consequence, to become an advisor to Zhou Enlai, and he was promoted to the Politburo. So the Politburo, that leadership committee, which decided everything that the CCP would do. So Mao managed to get a seat back onto that, and he also became key advisor to Zhou Enlai. So it's at the Zunyi Conference where Mao starts to, he re-establishes himself. And it's at the Zunyi Conference where Mao is the one who starts to direct what the marches do. He starts to be able to promote his style of guerrilla warfare tactics, which as a consequence enable the CCP to survive and successfully continue the march. The next key point, as I was referring to before, there are a number of key battles, but the most famous one is the Battle of Looting Bridge, 29th of May 1935. So this is a really significant battle in the story of the Long March. Looting Bridge is the actual place where I believe a Taiping general during the Taiping Rebellion, he was defeated there by the Qing forces in the 19th century and pretty much put an end to the Taiping Rebellion. The CCP had also went to Looting Bridge, but they were not defeated. They managed to cross it. So I've actually put a famous painting of the crossing of Looting Bridge up here. According to the accounts, there were 22 volunteers who were given the job of trying to capture this bridge and to try to go from one side of the bridge over to the other. On the opposite side of the bank was a garrison of Kuomintang troops who were firing at these 22 volunteers as they crossed. You can see here depicted in the image that there were a number of chains of the bridge, but a lot of the actual planks had been ripped up. So they had to cross these 22 volunteers. According to the accounts, they did manage to cross and they captured the other side, forced the GMD garrison to retreat, and this enabled the CCP, the rest of the CCP, to cross the river and continue on their march. This battle, the Battle of Looting Bridge, very significant because you can see there it exemplified the virtues of courage and perseverance under pressure and the revolutionary spirit of the Red Army. As a consequence of this, the CCP leadership, Mao Zedong himself and CCP soldiers started to believe that they worked hard enough, if they were courageous enough, if their revolutionary spirit was pure enough, if they persevered, then they would win. Because in their mind, what they were doing was right and good for the Chinese people. Another key point of the Long March was that it allowed the CCP to spread their revolutionary message to peasants in 11 provinces, many of whom would not have heard of the CCP before. So the CCP, they marched through huge swathes of China, huge areas of China where most, if not all, the peasants had no idea who the Communist Party were, the Chinese Communist Party were. Wherever these CCP long marches went, they educated the people. And they also practiced, or they redistributed land as well. So wherever they went, they took land of absentee landlords or corrupt landlords, abusive landlords, and they redistributed it to the peasants. As a consequence, popular support for the CCP in these areas rose, and another consequence of this popular support was the CCP was able to gain a number of new recruits into their army to join them on the Long March. And this last point here, it sort of links into what I was talking about with the beliefs that the CCP had about themselves as a consequence of the looting bridge. And Mao Zedong in particular, this belief, according to Meisner, so Morris Meisner, the historian, he argues that the Long March contributed to Mao's belief in himself, and I quote, as a man of destiny who would lead his followers to the completion of their revolutionary mission. So Meisner argues that Mao Zedong believed he was a man of destiny. Meisner discusses a lot about Mao Zedong's belief in the human will, this idea that the human will can shape reality if one believed strongly enough in something, then one would achieve this, and that's what Mao believed in himself. I've got just over here as well a quote from Red Star over China, and I'll open it up there. There we are. It's a quote in Red Star over China by Edgar Snow, that famous American journalist who wrote an account of the Long March and helped, from this account, people outside of China learned what happened along the Long March. Edgar Snow, he did interview Mao Zedong as well as a number of CCP leaders and CCP members at the Yan'an Soviet, and he writes, and this is he wrote in the Red Star over China what Mao said here. Mao's belief in what the actual Long March achieved, and I quote, well, has there ever been in history a Long March like ours? No, never. The Long March is a manifesto. It proclaims to the world that the Red Army is an army of heroes, and that the imperialists and their jackals, Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jin-shi, and his like are perfect non-entities. The Long March is also an agitation corps. So a group of people who work, political cadres who agitate for a cause. It declares to approximately 200 million people of 11 provinces that only the Red Army leads to their liberation, their freedom. The Long March is also a seeding machine. It has sown seeds in 11 provinces which will sprout, grow leaves, blossom into flowers, bear fruit and yield a crop in the future. To sum up, the Long March ended with victory for us, the CCP, and defeat for the enemy, the Kuomintang. Very, very famous quote there. So it achieved a number of things from Mao Zedong's perspective, and yeah, no doubt it was a key contributing factor to the CCP's eventual victory over the Kuomintang in 1949. So just before we go on, or actually we're going to go on now, you can see there's one image of the Long March, a portrait of Looting Bridge. There are lots and lots of paintings and posters about the Long March, and they can be included as sources on the exam. So you should be familiarise yourself with them. I've just got I've got another example over on the next slide, so let's just have a look at that now. So this one here on the right, you can see, this actually appeared on one of the previous exams a couple of years back. And it's an arduous journey scroll. So this is only one part of it. The scroll itself is far bigger, but this is like a little part of it. And you can see the long marches, and at the front here you got one long marcher with the red flag marching through mountainous areas and so forth. There's also images of this one here on the left. I've just put this up here just to make you aware of something. So this one, I made this mistake, and I just wanted to make sure that you don't make this mistake in the future. There's lots of images of Mao Zedong marching along, like this one, but this one I used to think this image was actually about the Long March, but it's not. It's prior to that, so it's during the Autumn Harvest Uprising, 1927, and I think it might also be when he's marching towards the Jinjiangshan Mountains after the failure of the Autumn Harvest Uprising. So just be careful when you look at images on the internet, and sometimes they're falsely stated that they are a Long March image when they actually aren't. Alright, let's move on and let's have a look at a couple of historical interpretations on the Long March. So the first one's here by Edgar Snow, and he writes, and once again from Red Star Over China, he writes, adventure, exploration, discovery, human courage and cowardice, ecstasy and triumph, suffering, sacrifice and loyalty, and then through it all, like a flame, this undimmed ardour and undying hope, and amazing revolutionary optimism of those thousands of youths who would not admit defeat either by man or nature or God or defeat. All of this and more are wrapped up in a history of an odyssey unequalled in modern times. So I bolded that last part there. An odyssey unequalled in modern times. For Edgar Snow, he believed what Mao Zedong and the other CCP leaders had done. He believed it was a triumph, according to his account, and it was, and also he believed it contributed to their eventual survival and eventual victory over the Kuomintang in 1949. Other historians, though, dispute this, and they dispute particular parts. In particular, the whole episode of the Looting Bridge. There's lots of historians who've looked at the Looting Bridge. They've gone back and tried to find eyewitness accounts of what happened, and probably the historians who disbelieve the whole Looting Bridge episode the most would be Jung Chang and John Halliday, and I've just got a quote here from their work. So, and I quote, "This bridge Dardu looting is the centre of the Long March myth, fed to the journalist Edgar Snow in 1936. This is complete invention. There was no battle at Dardu Bridge." So, for Edgar Snow, who gives us an account both of the Long March, but he also goes into the what happened at Looting Bridge. He believed it did happen. Chang and Halliday, they disagree. They say it's a myth and that there was really no battle there at all. So you've got two contrasting views there, which is very good for when you're going to talk about or include historical interpretations in your responses if you had a question about the Long March. So anyway, I hope this video on the Long March will be useful for you in your study of the Chinese Revolution, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.